Today we're actually going to bring you a client case study. Today's case study is going to feature Holland America Line, and the topic of this case study is how you can make your recovery effort a process and not just sort of a one-time project. Now, you may push back on that. You may be more comfortable in the one-time project environment, and that is always fine. We can always sustain a project environment. But what we're going to talk about today is how we use and how we leverage vendor file management and profit recovery so that this is something you can sustain over time with very little effort and very big impact, both in recoveries and in cleaning up your vendor file over time. I've supplied for you guys to get us all on the right foot this beautiful picture of one of Holland America's flagships, the Amsterdam, and this is something that I presented as well at the in-person presentation. I sat originally on a panel with Ellen Porterfield of Holland America Lines when we gave this presentation for the first time at the National Association of Payables and Procurements in Marina del Rey, California, back in the spring of 2010. And we covered, of course, our engagement history, the approach that we took, because it was very unique, kind of a rocky start, but it turned out really great. Talked a little bit about the results and some great aspects of what made this such a successful partnership. I say it was rocky because when we first approached Holland America Line, we were introduced by their parent company, another cruise line. We have worked with or are currently working with every major cruise line. And Holland America, they did not want to do another recovery audit. They had I think I can say, horrible experiences with other recovery auditors in the past. They simply took too much time and they didn't deliver results. In fact, Ellen's not joining me on this webisode, but I have pulled out a couple of her quotes from the case study. And you can see here where she says at the bottom that other audit firms have been too invasive and require too much support, but then she juxtaposes our services to require very little time and support. And I'm proud to repeat that she thinks of us as our results as being superb. And I agree with her. We began in mid-2007, and we took a very different approach. We rely on a supplier side approach. We do use some client AP side focus, but we kind of shun the traditional method, which is to focus almost exclusively on the accounts payable at the client. We adhere to a 6-month rolling audit, and any credits that we find in the supplier's records, we would then verify at the supplier level and then return to the client and put it on our interface and link it to supporting documentation and what have you. We didn't have major focus. We didn't have any bodies on site at their facility, and we didn't require any of their resources or their computers or their people to help us do our work. So they said, yeah, you know what, let's give this a shot. And we respected the fact that their AP department was absolutely top shelf as far as performance, as far as metrics, not making transactional errors. And we said we would go in and we would really give a look at the overlaps and the duplicates in the vendor file and start returning them results based on what we found as discrepancies in the vendor's processing of claims and transactions. When we go through these results, we're going to talk only about relative values. The client has requested that we don't talk in terms of hard numbers. I show a little bit, but nothing we can deduce too far from it. And what I'd like to do here is I'm going to baseline the first quarter of recoveries. So we're going to call the first quarter of recoveries 100% of the value. You'll see that in a future chart. And we'll just speak about future recoveries just relative to that first quarter. And we're going to dive a lot into the work that we did in the vendor file. We do a lot of cleanup in the vendor file, identifying overlaps and using that to feed recovery. First stat I want to point to is after about 2 years of service, we've changed we've changed attributes for 83% of the client's vendors. Now, we didn't change 83% of the vendors, and it isn't always a major attribute like a ship-to address or a billing address. But in half the cases, for half the vendors, we would identify where there's a new contact person, and thus it needs a new contact name or a new contact phone, or maybe a third of the emails were changed and needed to be updated in the file. Now, this type of change volume underscores why there are credits open on the vendor records. There's a communication gap between the client as soon as it is put into a client's ERP system. Dun & Bradstreet would echo these kind of sentiments. I believe they have a stat that says 20% of clients change their name on an annual basis. So you can see there's a lot of churn in the vendor file, and it's important to manage the vendors if you want to undergo a full-scale recovery process. not only are we able to identify overlaps to the vendor file, but we're able to communicate with vendors very effectively. Of the vendors that we addressed and targeted, in the 2-year process, we were able to receive 3.7 documents, that's 3.7 reports on average from all the vendors that we were targeting. So kind of let that sink in. If you were working on a project like this internally and doing a vendor statement review, what kind of resources and effort, and could you sustain it where you could communicate very effectively through all ranks of your vendor file and expect to recover almost 4 documents on that in 20, a lot of reach in our ability to communicate out to vendors. Now, what it all means and why we work so hard in managing the vendor file is because of this graph here. We have 2 different metrics colliding right here, and it tells the full story. If you just look at the blue bars stacked in the background, that represents recovery totals per quarter over time. Again, I baseline the first quarter as 100%. We're just going to call that 100% of the opportunity because that's when recoveries are the ripest. And you can see where recoveries trend down over about a year. And that's pretty consistent with most people's project mindset, where recoveries taper down, and there's no point in doing it anymore because it's a point of diminishing return versus the resources you're putting into the project. That blue trend line that moves up over the year, approaching 83%, that is the real-time vendor changes that we made in Holland America. Our vendor updates started to rise and peak, and that new information enables us to dig deeper into the vendor file and start churning new recoveries in all ranks of the vendor population. Let me give you an example of that. I'm showing you the Q4 2009 results. So this is just a snapshot from one quarter. I have the top 10 vendors by credit. I'm showing you what the total was for that vendor in credits and how much they spent with the vendor, and then you can deduce the rank. We just do a 1 to 100 scale. 99 rank means you spend a lot of money with them, and low ranks, like a single-digit rank, means you don't spend any money with them. So if we take a look at any number of these vendors, you can see that the first example, a lot of credits, a lot of spend. But if we go down second to the last, you can see where there's $29,000 of credits and no spend. So think about what that could possibly mean. It points information that this would deduce for you so that you can do better work in an ongoing environment. I'm actually drilling down to this vendor's record, that vendor record that garnered $29,000 of credits. And I'm showing circled in the middle of the page, you can see where in our parent and subsidiary report, we've identified a potential subsidiary. Now, the subsidiary, if we drill down into their records, they may have enough spend that would account for why credits would be up to $29,000. So you can see where the arrow points to the field in the middle of the page and shows us where the vendor ID is for the subsidiary. If I click on that, it would take me to that subsidiary's personal sheet here, and you can see where their rank is an 81 and their volume is $31,000. $31,000 of spend volume would, of course, cover why there would be $29,000 in credits. Now, that's a lot of credits per spend volume, but clearly there was a mislinkage here. Clearly they were talking to one vendor and didn't have insight into the other vendor, and that's probably an environment where you would have a high percentage of credits to your percentage of spend. I don't have the full analysis for this vendor, but you can see where once we start pulling on a thread like this, we really do learn a lot of information that we want to bring back to the client to clean their vendor file and to drive recoveries. So the question becomes, if we're going to go to that level, are we going to upset or are we going to rub the wrong way some of the vendors by probing a little too deeply? And I've put up a couple quotes from the Holland America Line vendors here just to kind of let you know what their mindset is. They enjoy the process, and they see the value in us going to their AR records and returning credits. That's a liability to them that they're ultimately going to have to sheet. In fact, if I point you to the third bullet here, we actually got asked by Holland America, one of Holland America's vendors, and this is not uncommon, how can they get us to work for them as well? So we point to flexible. We weathered a rocky start. We trumped up a lot of good mutual reports so that our two companies could work together, and we turned what didn't promise to be a successful partnership into a very successful partnership. Where they didn't think they wanted recovery, now they can't live without it. So thank you very much for viewing the webinar today. If you have any further questions, we completely encourage you guys to get in touch with us by emailing the address on the page.